Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to turn to software freedom activist and hacker Richard Stallman, president of the Free Software Foundation. Richard is in town because he spoke at the Bitcoin 2012 conference. We're happy to have him on the Keiser Report. Richard, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thanks, but since you've introduced me as a hacker, I better explain what that really means.
That's my first question, Richard Stallman. What is a hacker?
Hacking means playful cleverness, and a hacker is somebody who does hacking or appreciates hacking. So if you like being playfully clever, or if you enjoy seeing other people be playfully clever, then you're a hacker. Now, this doesn't have to be done with computers. You can do hacking in lots of media. For instance, when I see photos of Lady Gaga's costumes, I'm convinced that she is a hacker, at least in the area of clothing.
Right, so, in the old days when Hewlett and Packard were in their garage, I think they used to call it tinkering. Is that kind of the same thing?
Well, sure. If you're being playfully clever in designing circuits or writing software, then you're hacking.
Right, but for some reason, it's become a pejorative phrase, and the word hacker has become synonymous with doing bad things and breaking into systems.
Well, first of all, breaking security is not necessarily bad. It can be bad or good depending on what you do with the access thus gained. But in any case, the reason why many people think that's what it means is the confusion of journalists around 1981 when they found out about hackers. They somehow focused on one activity that some hackers did some of the time, which was breaking security on computers, and they ignored all the rest of what hackers did. Now, my hacking hardly ever had to do with security, except in cases where I protested against security, which is not the same thing as breaking security.
Right. Now, Richard Stallman, you're known for developing and promoting free software, and you approach software as somebody approaching a box of crayons. It's a tool set that anyone should have access to create any manner of things on the web, and the impediment to this has been copyright. And copyright
Actually, I don't agree.
Go ahead.
First of all, it's not just a matter of creating something, it's a matter of having control over the software you use. If you use something to do a practical job, if people use a work to do a practical job, those people deserve to have control over the work they are using. And that includes software, because software is a work that's made for doing practical jobs with. So free software is the software that's controlled by its users. And in order for the users to have that control, they need the four essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program however you wish. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code and change it so the program does your computing the way you wish. These two freedoms give users individual control, one user at a time, but that's not enough. Partly because most users don't know how to program, so they don't know how to exercise freedom 1, at least not directly. So we need collective control as well, and for that we need two more freedoms. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help others, to redistribute exact copies of the program, and freedom 3 is the freedom to contribute to your community, that is, to distribute copies of your modified version. With the four freedoms together, any group of users, whether it's 2 users or 1 million users, can exercise control over its version of this program. And so the free software is a software that the users control, but if the program is not free software, and it's free as in freedom, of course, then it's the program that controls the users. But the owner of the program controls the program, and through it, exercises unjust power over the users. So a non-free program is a yoke. It's an instrument for subjugating other people. And the idea of the free software movement is get rid of non-free software. Software users, users of computing, must be free. They must have control over the computing they do.
All right, let's talk about the biggest company in the world, the biggest computer company in the world, Apple Computer. Of course, it has a reputation that goes back to the origins of the founder of having something of a hippie ethos. but they're very hard when it comes to digital rights management and protection of intellectual property,
Oh,
et cetera.
please don't use those propaganda terms. You're talking about digital restrictions management. That's what it is for the victims, the general public. Now, the perpetrators, of course, they want to make it sound good, so they call it digital rights management. Both of these terms put spin on it. Each of these terms takes a side. You choose your side and you choose your term. So I call it digital restrictions management. As for, quote, intellectual property, unquote, that doesn't really mean anything because it means a dozen or so unrelated laws that do totally different things. Just to mention two of them, there is copyright law and there's patent law. And those laws are totally different. Their effects in the computer field are completely different. So if you think of them as one thing, you're not going to understand either one. So anytime somebody starts talking to you and using the term, quote, intellectual property, unquote, what he's saying is vague and confused. And if you want to get to the truth, you should pin him down. What are you really talking about here? And maybe you'll find out he's talking about copyrights. Or maybe you'll find out he's talking about trade secrets. Or maybe you'll find out he's talking about controlled geographical terms like Bordeaux for a wine. Or there are several other things he might be talking about, and he may not even realize that they're different, because that term confuses every discussion it enters into.
Okay, clearly, Richard Stallman.
But you mentioned Apple.
Okay, yeah. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, Apple.
Apple is the pioneer in designing computers to restrict their users even more. And the users recognize this. When they speak about breaking some of the digital handcuffs in the eye things, they call it jailbreaking, which recognizes that those computers are designed as jails. If you don't want to live in jail, don't use them. But now that Apple has paved the way, Microsoft is following the same path. Windows 8 does the same nasty thing. It's censorship of application programs, which Apple practices in an essentially arbitrary way for its own business interests.
Clearly, in the history of the internet over the past 15 years, 20 years, and you, of course, were involved in the creation going back to the 1970s. But the history now is radically changing. The privileges and rights that were enjoyed by the majority of users are being stripped, correct? And so where is this headed? If we don't act now, what are we talking about?
Well, for years, we've been concerned that big companies want to turn the internet essentially into a broadcasting system where everything people do is under the control of some big company because they're doing it together with some server belonging to a big company, and that company imposes whatever rules it chooses to impose. And then we have the copyright industry that is trying to turn the web into a system of censorship, and the internet requires surveillance in order to do censorship, so with the censorship goes total surveillance also. And you see this with the systems of punishment without trial. The UK has an official system of punishment without trial called the Digital Economy Act. In the US, there's no such law, but Obama brokered a friendly agreement between the major ISPs and the movie and record companies, which are the enemies of the freedom of internet users, where the ISPs will unofficially punish people without trial if they're accused of sharing. You only have to be accused. No proof is required. Of course, sharing shouldn't be punished at all in any fashion because sharing is good. That's part of why we should have the internet, so people can share copies of any published work. Now, when I say share, I mean something specific. I mean non-commercial redistribution of exact copies. Sharing must be legal, sharing, that is, of any published work. People shouldn't be allowed to share your personal data. That's a different kind of issue. But once something is published, it's available in some fashion to anybody. So there's no secrecy about that, and people should be free to share it. It's got to be legalized. All the things that they do to try to stop people from sharing, they are all evil in their purpose. And of course, they tend to be evil in their methods, because sharing is good, and with the internet, sharing is easy, so people share. And when somebody is trying to stop you from doing something that's both easy and good, it's not easy to stop you. They're going to have to threaten to hurt you in nasty ways. So that's what they do. With these 3 strikes type laws of punishment without trial, they abolish the basic principle of justice: no punishment without a fair trial. And that shows just how far they're willing to go in destroying everything that a just society is based on to achieve their evil ends.
All right, Richard Stallman, you're talking about educating people to these concepts. There's another group of folks out there that are being a lot more aggressive. Anonymous, Lulzsec, etc. They're taking a much more confrontational approach. Your thoughts?
Well, Anonymous is not being aggressive. Anonymous does protests in the virtual world that are comparable to common protests in the physical world. For instance, when they get lots of people to send lots of requests to a website all at once, that's like having a protest in front of the door of a building. Now, having a protest in front of the door of a building is not a crime, but we're under the control of the empire of the corporations. The governments that rule our countries are governments of occupation. They don't work for us, they don't represent us, they pretend to, but they're really working for the empire. And so they seek to criminalize protest whenever they can. So in the US, we saw massive protests, also in the UK, in the Occupy movement, and they were crushed by force. And journalists were attacked as well, again and again. But it's one opportunity to criminalize protest is when the form changes. When people move from physical space protests to virtual protests, it's comparable, but it's not exactly the same thing. And that's an opportunity to declare it a crime. So the virtual street protests of Anonymous are labeled as DDoS attacks, and they're described with the vocabulary of criminality, and people are punished essentially for protesting in front of the door. But that's just because they're the enemies of democracy that are doing this, that are trying to punish people for practicing democracy.
All right, Richard Stallman, president of Free Software Foundation. We're out of time. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report. We'll have to leave it there. We'll have you on back soon.
Happy hacking.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Richard Stallman, president of the Free Software Foundation. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.